In the autumn of 1944, Europe was entering one of the most decisive phases of the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had advanced deep into Central and Southeastern Europe, driving back German forces after a series of powerful summer offensives. The fall of Romania in August had shifted the balance further. Once a staunch ally of Germany, Romania had abruptly changed sides after King Michael's coup on 23rd of August, joining the Allies and declaring war on its former partner. This political reversal placed Romanian troops under Soviet command and turned former allies into enemies on the battlefield almost overnight. Northern Transylvania, ceded to Hungary under the Second Vienna Award in 1940, now became the center of one of the bloodiest confrontations between Romania, the Soviet Union, and Axis forces composed of German and Hungarian units. The Mureș Valley, with its natural defensive features, became one of the key corridors in the fight for Transylvania. Strategically, the region held great importance for both sides. For the Red Army and its new Romanian allies, rapid progress through Transylvania was necessary to cut into central Hungary and eventually drive toward Budapest. For the German High Command and its Hungarian allies, defending Transylvania meant protecting vital routes into the Hungarian plain and buying time for defensive preparations west of the Carpathians. The city of Cluj, as well as the lines along the Mureș River, became focal points of the struggle. Romania entered this stage of the war in a difficult position. Its army, numbering close to 400,000 men after mobilization, was in the process of reorganizing following years of combat alongside the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Units that had previously fought in southern Ukraine, Crimea, and Bessarabia were now placed under the overall coordination of the Soviet 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts. Equipment was often worn, and losses during the retreat from previous campaigns had weakened divisions. Yet, despite these difficulties, Romania's new political leadership sought to demonstrate loyalty to the Allied cause by committing its forces decisively in the upcoming operations. Opposing them were elements of the German 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army, regrouping after the collapse of the front in Romania. German forces included divisions of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, supported by armored and artillery units still capable of stiff resistance. The Hungarian troops defending northern Transylvania were highly motivated, seeing this territory as integral to their national identity, having regained it only 4 years earlier. Their commanders were determined to resist Romanian attempts to reclaim it, and the rugged river-cross terrain provided strong natural defensive lines. Intelligence estimates on both sides suggested that the battles would be costly, and both German and Hungarian leaders viewed the Mureș sector as essential to slowing the Soviet advance. The international context also played a significant role. For the Soviet Union, securing Transylvania was part of a larger strategy to dominate post-war Eastern Europe. Joseph Stalin's objectives extended beyond military gains, aiming to solidify political influence in Romania and Hungary. For Romania, the stakes were both national and political. Regaining northern Transylvania was seen as a way to legitimize the government's decision to switch allegiance and to restore territorial integrity after years of humiliation under Axis dominance. Hungary, meanwhile, faced increasing pressure as the war turned against Germany. Its alliance with Berlin was strained but remained critical, as Hungarian leaders feared both Soviet occupation and Romanian territorial claims. Civilians in Transylvania lived under great uncertainty in this period. Ethnic Romanians and Hungarians often found themselves caught between shifting front lines, competing propaganda, and mobilization efforts. The memory of earlier border changes in 1940, which had divided communities, heightened tensions. As armies massed along the Mureș River in September 1944, local populations prepared for yet another wave of destruction, evacuations, and requisitions that had already become a recurring feature of the war. By early October, conditions for the coming battle were set. On one side, the Soviet 27th Army and Romanian 4th Army prepared for offensive operations aimed at breaching the German-Hungarian positions along the Oarba de Mureș sector. On the other, entrenched Axis units, including elements of the German 8th Army and Hungarian divisions, awaited the assault, using the terrain to their advantage. The clash that followed would prove devastating, producing some of the heaviest casualties suffered by Romanian forces in the entire war, and leaving a deep imprint on the memory of all nations involved. On 22 September 1944, the Red Army's Second Ukrainian Front under Marshal Rodion, Malinovsky initiated operations designed to force the Axis from central Transylvania. The Soviet 27th Army, commanded by General Sergei Trofimenko, was directed to advance along the Mureș River Valley, supported by Romanian forces newly subordinated to Soviet command. Among these, the Romanian 4th Army under General Gheorghe Avramescu played a central role. The objective was to break through German and Hungarian defenses near the village of Oarba de Mureș, seize crossing points over the river, and secure a corridor toward Târgu Mureș. The task was formidable. Axis positions were deeply entrenched, supported by artillery and reinforced by the natural barrier of the Mureș itself. The Axis command structure at this stage was equally determined. The German 8th Army, under General Otto Wöhler, coordinated with Hungarian units to defend the approaches. The Hungarian 2nd Army contributed several divisions to hold the sector, including infantry and border guard formations familiar with the terrain. Reinforced with German artillery and occasional armored detachments, their defenses were arranged in depth, using elevated ground south of the river to dominate any attempted crossing. Minefields and interlocking fields of fire strengthened their positions, making frontal assaults exceptionally hazardous. For the Romanian troops, the situation was complicated by recent reorganization. Divisions such as the 9th Infantry and the 11th Infantry were re-equipped with Soviet-supplied weapons, while maintaining older German material captured or left behind. Coordination with Soviet command structures was still developing, and language barriers, differences in doctrine, and political mistrust created additional strains. Nevertheless, Romanian leaders pressed their forces forward, conscious that active participation in the offensive was essential to secure international recognition of Romania's claims to northern Transylvania. The first clashes began with artillery duels along the riverbanks. Soviet batteries unleashed heavy bombardments against Axis fortifications, attempting to soften resistance. Yet many positions were built into hillsides or concealed in forests, reducing the effectiveness of preparatory fire. When infantry units began their advance across open ground, they faced concentrated machine gun fire, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery. The Mureș Valley offered little natural cover, and attacking troops were exposed to defenders positioned on commanding heights. Romanian soldiers tasked with storming these positions found themselves in especially perilous conditions, advancing shoulder to shoulder with Soviet units but sustaining disproportionately high losses. Axis commanders quickly recognized the importance of maintaining control over Oarba de Mureș. German and Hungarian officers reinforced their forward lines with reserves, ensuring that any temporary breaches could be countered. Hungarian accounts emphasized the determination of local troops, who fought with the knowledge that they were defending territory claimed as national soil. German reports, on the other hand, highlight the value of the defensive terrain and the necessity of holding the line to prevent Soviet armor from breaking into the central Hungarian plain. On the Soviet side, pressure mounted to accelerate progress. The broader campaign aimed not only to liberate Transylvania, but also to set the stage for the encirclement of Budapest. Delays at Oarba threatened the timetable and risked extending the exposure of flanks elsewhere. Soviet officers pressed for renewed assaults despite the evident difficulties. Romanian commanders complied, driven by both strategic necessity and political calculations. The attacks intensified in early October, involving repeated attempts to storm the fortified hillsides south of the Mureș. Civilian populations in nearby villages endured the consequences of this escalation. Requisitions of food, livestock, and shelter increased as armies expanded their presence. Bombardments destroyed homes and fields, forcing many to flee toward less contested areas. For both Hungarian and Romanian civilians, the fighting reawakened older grievances and deepened mistrust, as front lines shifted and military authorities imposed strict controls. Witnesses recalled the river valley echoing with artillery fire day and night, transforming once quiet farmlands into a contested battlefield. By the beginning of October, the opening phase of the battle had already produced severe casualties. especially among Romanian units. Yet neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Soviets and Romanians held tenuous bridgeheads, but had failed to dislodge the Axis defenders from the commanding ridges. The stage was set for an even bloodier continuation, as repeated assaults would test the endurance of both attackers and defenders in the days to come. The continuation of operations in early October 1944 brought the contest at Oarba de Mureș into a new and more destructive phase. After the first failed attempts to dislodge the Axis defenders, Soviet and Romanian commanders sought to reinforce their attacking formations and renew the effort with greater intensity. Orders were issued for the Romanian 4th Army to commit additional divisions, including the 9th, 11th, and 19th Infantry Divisions, supported by artillery groups hastily repositioned along the river. The Soviet 27th Army added fresh rifle regiments and tank units intended to exploit any breach. The goal remained unchanged, to establish a durable bridgehead across the Mureș and clear the dominating high ground south of the river that barred the route to Târgu Mureș. The operational plan relied on repeated frontal assaults, reflecting both the urgency of the campaign and the limitations of available options. Pontoon bridges were laid across the river under cover of darkness, while engineers attempted to clear paths through minefields. Yet every movement was observed from Axis positions on higher ground, and artillery observers quickly directed fire onto concentrations of troops and equipment. German and Hungarian units exploited their defensive advantages to the full. The 8th Army ensured overlapping arcs of fire, while Hungarian regiments made determined counterattacks to eliminate any penetrations. The result was that Romanian and Soviet forces often advanced only a few hundred meters before being forced back with heavy losses. For Romanian infantry, conditions were particularly severe. Units advancing across open slopes faced sustained fire from machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery batteries. Reports describe battalions losing half their strength in a single day of combat. The 9th Infantry Division, tasked with repeated assaults on Hill 426, suffered devastating casualties. Soldiers advanced in waves, but the defenders' firepower, supported by German Nabelwerfer rocket artillery and entrenched heavy weapons, inflicted immense destruction. Survivors recalled the battlefield littered with equipment and fallen comrades, while the river itself became an obstacle strewn with wreckage of attempted crossings. Soviet participation, though substantial, often relied on Romanian units to spearhead attacks in the most exposed sectors. Soviet armor, including T-34s, was hampered by the steep terrain and limited bridgeheads, reducing its ability to support the infantry effectively. Artillery bombardments from the Soviet side were massive, but frequently fell short of neutralizing the hardened defensive positions. The Red Army pressed its allies to maintain the offensive, reflecting both strategic necessity and Stalin's insistence that Romania demonstrate commitment after its recent political reversal. On the Axis side, commanders praised the resilience of their troops. German units, though depleted after previous retreats, fought with professional discipline, using mobile reserves to counterattack at critical points. Hungarian divisions, defending what they considered national territory, displayed determination in holding trenches and strongpoints. Supplies were limited, yet the defensive line at Oarba de Mureș remained intact through a combination of favorable terrain, effective coordination, and the high cost imposed on attacking forces. Civilians in nearby villages bore the brunt of this escalation. Farms and vineyards were destroyed by artillery fire, and whole communities were displaced as front lines shifted. Requisitions by both armies deprived the population of remaining resources. Accounts mention villagers sheltering in cellars while artillery duels raged above, emerging only to find homes and fields devastated. For many, the battle represented not only a military confrontation, but also the collapse of everyday life in the region. By mid-October, the cumulative effect of these operations was catastrophic for Romanian forces. Estimates indicate that, in less than 3 weeks of fighting, Romanian casualties at Oarba de Mureș exceeded 11,000 killed and wounded. Soviet losses were also substantial, though spread across multiple formations. Axis defenders, while suffering fewer casualties, were increasingly strained by the need to hold their lines against relentless pressure. Despite the enormous sacrifice, the attackers had still not secured decisive control of the commanding heights, and the battle threatened to become a prolonged war of attrition. Yet, Soviet and Romanian leadership remained committed to further assaults, convinced that control of the valley was indispensable for the advance into central Transylvania. The intensification of the battle in the second half of October 1944 marked the peak of attrition at Oarba de Mureș. After weeks of inconclusive but bloody assaults, Soviet and Romanian commanders attempted to coordinate new large-scale attacks designed to overwhelm the Axis defenses. Pressure from higher command was relentless. Marshal Malinovsky, leading the Second Ukrainian Front, demanded that the front line move forward to maintain the timetable for the advance into Hungary. Soviet planning emphasized constant pressure, arguing that the Axis forces, weakened by recent retreats from Romania, could not withstand prolonged fighting. In practice, the strength of the defenses and the determination of Hungarian and German troops meant that each new assault became a repetition of previous failures at a terrible human cost. Romanian units, especially the Fourth Army, bore the brunt of these renewed operations. The 9th Infantry Division, already depleted, was ordered again into action against fortified positions around Hill 426 and the adjacent high ground. The 11th and 19th Infantry Divisions attempted simultaneous thrusts across narrower sectors of the Mureș Valley. Supporting artillery fired thousands of shells daily, and Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers added barrages intended to suppress Axis batteries. Despite this, defenders emerged from bunkers and trenches once the bombardments lifted, remanning their weapons to cut down advancing troops. The slope of the terrain made attacks highly visible, and repeated Romanian charges often collapsed under sustained machine gun and mortar fire before reaching enemy trenches. On the Axis side, the German 8th Army continued to manage its resources carefully. The Hungarian 2nd Army, defending the sector with several divisions, absorbed the majority of attacks. German officers positioned their artillery in depth, coordinating fire missions with Hungarian infantry units in the front line. The combination of elevated terrain, overlapping fields of fire, and a network of fortified positions created an almost textbook defensive environment. Even limited Axis counterattacks, launched by companies or battalions, inflicted heavy losses on exhausted Romanian formations, trying to maintain bridgeheads along the river. The Romanian High Command faced growing frustration. General Avramescu's reports noted unsustainable casualties and warned of declining morale among troops who had been ordered into repeated frontal assaults with little tangible success. Soviet commanders, however, dismissed these concerns, insisting that the offensive continue. For the Soviet leadership, the urgency of reaching the Hungarian plain outweighed the toll on Romanian manpower. Political considerations also influenced these decisions. Stalin expected Romania to prove its loyalty through sacrifice, and Romanian leaders, eager to secure northern Transylvania after 4 years under Hungarian control, complied despite the growing disaster. Conditions for ordinary soldiers were dire. Diaries and testimonies speak of advancing across fields already covered with the dead from earlier assaults, of units reduced to half strength within days, and of regiments that lost their commanders in action only to be ordered forward again. Supply difficulties compounded the hardship. Ammunition and rations often lagged behind the pace of battle, while field hospitals overflowed with casualties. Medical personnel struggled to treat the wounded under continuous shelling, and many soldiers died before reaching aid stations. Prisoners taken by both sides described the horror of repeated failed attacks and the sense of inevitability surrounding the attrition. Meanwhile, civilians in the surrounding villages experienced devastation on a massive scale. Entire communities were displaced as artillery duels destroyed farms and homes. Survivors recalled herding livestock through forests or hiding in barns while shells fell around them. The local economy collapsed under the demands of 2 armies and the destruction of harvests. For ethnic Romanians, the prospect of regaining control of the region was coupled with grief at the enormous losses being endured by their own army. For Hungarians, the defense of the land was tied to a broader struggle for survival as the front pushed deeper into their country. By the last weeks of October, it had become clear that the sector around Oarba de Mureș had become a killing ground. Romanian casualties continued to rise into the tens of thousands, with divisions effectively shattered. Axis forces had not escaped unscathed. German and Hungarian units lost men in constant bombardments and counterattacks, but their defensive positions remained intact. Despite the mounting toll, Soviet and Romanian leadership refused to halt the assaults, believing that persistent pressure would eventually force a breakthrough. This persistence ensured that the coming weeks would bring further tragedy as the battle approached its bloodiest climax. By late October 1944, the battle at Oarba de Mureș had reached a point where persistence replaced maneuver. Each side committed resources in the belief that endurance would deliver victory, but the geographical and tactical realities of the battlefield favored the defenders. The hills south of the Mureș, lined with trenches, bunkers, and fortified artillery positions, ensured that even massive bombardments failed to create lasting breaches. As Romanian and Soviet troops pushed forward time after time, the clash turned into one of attrition with no quick resolution. Romanian formations were reorganized to replenish their strength, often by combining remnants of decimated regiments. Replacements arrived from other fronts, including younger recruits hastily mobilized after Romania's shift of allegiance. Many lacked combat experience, yet they were thrust into some of the most difficult assaults of the campaign. The 19th Infantry Division, committed repeatedly in October, suffered staggering rates of attrition, losing officers and men faster than replacements could arrive. Soviet liaison officers pressed for continuous attacks, interpreting any hesitation as reluctance to fight. Romanian commanders, caught between their political obligation and the desperate condition of their units, had little room for resistance. Soviet contributions at Oarba de Mureș included heavy artillery and air support. IL-2 ground attack aircraft struck Axis positions, strafing trenches and bombarding supply points. Yet the rugged terrain and the well-camouflaged defenses reduced the effectiveness of air operations. German and Hungarian anti-aircraft guns, positioned to protect the most critical sectors, inflicted losses on Soviet pilots attempting low-level attacks. On the ground, Soviet rifle units supported Romanian divisions, but their main focus remained broader operations of the Second Ukrainian Front. Consequently, the Romanian Fourth Army carried the primary burden in this sector. The Axis, meanwhile, continued to exploit the natural advantages of the terrain. German and Hungarian divisions rotated units in and out of the line, preserving cohesion and maintaining morale despite continuous bombardments. Defensive doctrine emphasized counterattacks at night or during lulls in artillery fire, preventing the attackers from consolidating gains. Mortar fire proved especially lethal, targeting assembly areas and pontoon bridges. German naval-warfare rockets, launched in salvos, had a significant psychological effect, causing panic among troops exposed in open fields. The human cost mounted daily. Romanian casualty figures for the battles around Oarba de Mureș reached levels unmatched in any other single engagement after the August coup. Field hospitals overflowed, with wounded soldiers often lying untreated for hours or days. Testimonies from medical staff describe improvised surgeries performed in barns, shortages of morphine, and the inability to evacuate casualties under constant shell fire. Morale among Romanian units deteriorated as soldiers realized that success seemed unattainable, yet orders for renewed attacks continued to arrive. For Hungarian defenders, the battle carried both strategic and symbolic weight. Officers emphasized to their men that holding the line prevented the loss of northern Transylvania, a region claimed as integral to the Hungarian state. German commanders viewed the sector as essential to delaying the Soviet advance toward Budapest. Reports from Axis units record pride in the resilience of their positions, even as ammunition supplies became strained. Local Hungarian civilians, meanwhile, were drawn into the logistical effort, assisting with fortifications and enduring the destruction wrought by Soviet and Romanian artillery barrages. As October drew to a close, the broader context of the Eastern Front weighed heavily on the situation. The Red Army was pressing into Hungary from multiple directions, and Budapest itself was becoming a strategic objective. The battle at Oarba de Mureș, though costly, was part of a wider campaign to push Axis forces out of the Carpathian Basin. For Romania, however, the battle took on disproportionate significance. the scale of casualties created a national trauma, even as the government insisted that these sacrifices demonstrated loyalty to the Allied cause and justified Romania's claim to northern Transylvania. By early November, the offensive at Oarba de Mureș began to lose momentum. Exhausted Romanian divisions were withdrawn or reassigned, while Soviet forces shifted their main effort further west, toward Cluj and beyond. The battlefield itself remained scarred by trenches, destroyed villages, and the unburied dead of weeks of combat. The Axis defenders had succeeded in holding the sector longer than anticipated, but at the cost of tying down forces that were increasingly needed elsewhere. The battle, unresolved in tactical terms, had nonetheless defined the experience of thousands of soldiers and civilians, setting the stage for the next phase of operations deeper into Transylvania. As November 1944 advanced, the struggle for control of northern Transylvania entered a broader stage, but the memory and consequences of Oarba de Mureș remained raw for all participants. Romanian divisions that had been mauled in repeated attacks were gradually pulled back for reorganization. Some were transferred to quieter sectors, while others were rebuilt with fresh recruits and Soviet-supplied equipment. Yet the losses they had suffered continued to weigh heavily, not only on the units themselves, but also on Romanian military and political leadership. The country's new alliance with the Soviet Union demanded visible commitment, and Oarba had provided it at a tremendous human cost. Soviet operational planning moved on quickly. The Second Ukrainian Front intensified its drive towards central Hungary, seeking to cut Axis lines of retreat and surround Budapest. Soviet commanders assessed the battles along the Mureș not as isolated defeats or victories, but as necessary stages in a larger strategic offensive. To them, the sacrifices of Oarba were justified by the broader advance, which was rapidly shifting the war into Hungarian territory. However, Romanian officers remained conscious of the perception at home, where families mourned the thousands of soldiers lost in a relatively confined area with little territorial gain to show for it. For the Axis, the battle was viewed as a defensive success. Reports from the German 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army praised the resilience of troops who had held fortified positions despite overwhelming enemy pressure. The defense at Oarba was cited as evidence that disciplined and well-prepared units could still resist Soviet advances, even late in the war. However, such success was temporary. The continuous advance of Soviet and Romanian forces elsewhere gradually made the line at Oarba less relevant. German commanders redeployed some of their formations to prepare for the defense of Budapest, recognizing that holding ground in Transylvania alone could not change the overall situation. Civilian experiences during this period reflected exhaustion and dislocation. Villages around Oarba de Mureș were devastated, with fields cratered by artillery fire and homes reduced to rubble. Survivors who had fled during the fighting often returned to ruins, facing a winter with scarce shelter and food. The ethnic divide in Transylvania also shaped perceptions of the battle. For Romanian villagers, the enormous sacrifices of their army were remembered as proof of their claim to the land. For Hungarian communities, the defense became a symbol of resistance against both Soviet occupation and Romanian territorial ambitions. These diverging interpretations foreshadowed long-lasting political and cultural tensions in the region. Within Romania, the losses at Oarba influenced both military policy and public sentiment. The government of King Michael emphasized loyalty to the Allied cause, portraying the sacrifice as necessary for regaining national integrity. Yet among soldiers, bitterness grew at the scale of losses ordered by Soviet command. Diaries and memoirs written after the war describe a sense of being used as expendable forces, ordered into hopeless assaults to demonstrate political reliability rather than achieve realistic tactical objectives. These perceptions deepened skepticism towards Soviet leadership, even as Romania remained firmly in the Allied camp. On the Hungarian side, propaganda portrayed the defense as a stand for national survival. Soldiers who fought at Oarba were celebrated as defenders of Hungarian soil against overwhelming odds. Yet civilians across Hungary increasingly felt the strain of total war. By November, Budapest was preparing for siege, and the defense of Transylvania was understood as only one part of a much larger struggle that Hungary could not win without German support. German propaganda, in turn, used the example of Oarba to argue that resistance could still buy time and perhaps alter political outcomes, though privately German officers acknowledged that the overall strategic position was deteriorating rapidly. The memory of the battlefield itself lingered long after the front moved westward. Survivors spoke of fields littered with weapons, uniforms, and unburied dead. The winter rains washed through trenches and shell craters, carrying reminders of the battle into the river. Farmers attempting to resume work in the spring of 1945 found their land unusable, covered with debris and unexploded ordnance. The material destruction mirrored the psychological scars borne by soldiers and civilians alike. By the end of 1944, Oarba de Mureș had become both a symbol and a cautionary tale. For the Soviets, it was a demonstration of relentless pressure, regardless of casualties. For the Romanians, it was a reminder of the price of alliance and the burden of proving loyalty. For the Germans and Hungarians, it was a momentary validation of defensive doctrine, even as the broader tide of war turned against them. The campaign was shifting into Hungary itself, but the consequences of the battle along the Mureș would continue to shape perceptions and decisions for months, and indeed for decades to come. The later weeks of 1944 and the beginning of 1945 revealed how the consequences of Oarba de Mureș extended beyond the battlefield itself. Although the immediate front had moved westward into Hungary, the losses suffered there left a deep imprint on the Romanian army and society. Divisions shattered in the valley were slowly rebuilt with new drafts, often consisting of very young conscripts and reservists. Training was abbreviated, equipment was a mixture of Soviet-supplied weapons and leftover German material, and units were hurriedly reconstituted to keep pace with the Red Army's advance. Survivors of Oarba often became the cadre around which these fresh formations were organized, but the memories of the slaughter accompanied them into subsequent battles in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Within the Romanian command structure, the experience provoked ongoing tension with Soviet superiors. General Avramescu and other Romanian officers repeatedly attempted to argue against frontal assaults on entrenched positions, pointing to the casualty figures sustained at Oarba as evidence of the futility of such methods. Soviet commanders, however, continued to dictate operational plans, insisting that Romanian troops bear a large share of the burden. Politically, Stalin expected Romania to pay for its years of participation in the Axis war effort through sacrifice on the battlefield. The Romanian government, dependent on Soviet goodwill to secure northern Transylvania, had little leverage to resist. Thus, the Oarba experience came to symbolize Romania's limited autonomy within the alliance and the cost of its strategic realignment. For the Axis, Oarba was interpreted differently. Hungarian military reports lauded the defenders who had held off repeated assaults, framing the battle as evidence of Hungarian resolve in the defense of Transylvania. German accounts emphasized the value of defensive preparation and the effective use of artillery in halting superior numbers. Yet such narratives masked the broader reality. While Oarba had been a tactical success for the Axis, it did not prevent the eventual Soviet and Romanian capture of Transylvania. By late October and November 1944, the cities of Cluj and Târgu Mureș had fallen, and the Axis forces were retreating toward Budapest. The battle had bought time, but could not alter the strategic outcome. Civilian experiences in the region remained marked by devastation. Villages destroyed in the fighting were slow to recover. Many families were displaced permanently, their homes lost to bombardment. Ethnic tensions deepened, as both Romanian and Hungarian civilians carried competing memories of the conflict. For Romanians, the battle was remembered as proof of their army's sacrifice to regain lost territory. For Hungarians, it was remembered as a desperate defense against overwhelming forces, later overshadowed by the Soviet occupation of their homeland. These differing perspectives meant that Oarba became a contested memory, woven into competing national narratives long after the guns fell silent. The psychological toll on soldiers was equally significant. Accounts from veterans describe feelings of futility and bitterness, particularly among Romanians who felt they had been used as expendable troops by their Soviet allies. Letters and memoirs speak of advancing repeatedly over the same blood-soaked ground, of comrades lost in futile charges, and of the haunting sight of entire battalions reduced to fragments within hours. Hungarian and German veterans, in contrast, often recalled pride in their successful defense, though their memories were also scarred by the destruction and the inevitability of eventual retreat. On all sides, the battle left enduring trauma that shaped the post-war recollections of those who had survived. In the broader campaign, Oarba de Mureș demonstrated the limitations of both offensive and defensive doctrines in late 1944. For the Soviets and Romanians, it showed the dangers of underestimating entrenched defenders in difficult terrain. For the Germans and Hungarians, it showed that even successful defenses could only delay the advance of a vastly larger coalition. Strategically, the battle had little influence on the outcome of the war in the region, yet tactically, it became one of the costliest episodes of the Transylvanian campaign. The disparity between its limited strategic value and its enormous human cost made it one of the most tragic battles fought on Romanian soil during the Second World War. By early 1945, as the front moved deeper into Hungary, the Oarba battlefield lay silent, marked by ruins and mass graves. Soldiers moved on to new engagements, but the memory of the valley lingered. Romanian troops carried it with them into the battles for Budapest, Slovak territory, and eventually Czechoslovakia. Hungarian survivors carried it into the desperate defense of their capital, and civilians, returning slowly to shattered villages, faced the long process of rebuilding amidst the scars of war. Oarba de Mureș had become more than a tactical engagement. It was a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and contested memory that would resonate for decades. As the war shifted into Hungary during the winter of 1944-1945, the legacy of Oarba de Mureș began to crystallize. For Romania, the battle became a central point of reference in both military planning and national identity. The cost in lives was staggering, with some estimates placing Romanian casualties at more than 11,000 in a matter of weeks. Although the front had moved west, the army remained haunted by the experience. Commanders used it as a lesson in the dangers of frontal assaults without adequate preparation, yet they remained under Soviet control and often unable to avoid similar scenarios elsewhere. For ordinary soldiers, Oarba served as a warning of what awaited them if orders were followed blindly, deepening mistrust of Soviet command decisions. Politically, the Romanian government seized upon the tragedy to underline its commitment to the Allied cause. Officials highlighted the sacrifices of Romanian soldiers as evidence that the country had paid its price for switching sides and deserved recognition in post-war negotiations. Northern Transylvania, which had been at the center of dispute since the Second Vienna Award of 1940, was finally reincorporated into Romania after the war. The bloodshed at Oarba was later invoked as justification, reinforcing the narrative that territorial recovery had been earned through sacrifice rather than simply granted by external powers. This interpretation, while politically useful, did not erase the bitterness felt within the army over the circumstances of the battle. In Hungary, the battle carried different connotations. The defense at Oarba was remembered as a moment when Hungarian soldiers, fighting alongside German allies, managed to halt overwhelming Soviet and Romanian assaults for weeks. Hungarian narratives emphasized resilience and the determination to defend land, considered an inseparable part of the nation. However, as the Soviet advance continued and Budapest came under siege by the late 1944, the symbolic value of Oarba was overshadowed by the larger catastrophe engulfing the country. For many Hungarians, the battle became a fragment of a wider story of national tragedy during the war's final months. German perspectives treated Oarba as a tactical demonstration of effective defense, but also as an example of the broader hopelessness of their position in Southeast Europe. Wehrmacht reports noted with satisfaction the heavy losses inflicted on the attackers, yet senior officers were aware that such victories could only delay, not prevent, the Soviet advance. The defense tied down Soviet and Romanian forces for a time, but at the cost of diverting units that might otherwise have been redeployed to defend Budapest or other critical points. Thus, while German military doctrine was validated at the tactical level, the battle revealed the broader strategic exhaustion of the Reich. For civilians, the aftermath of Oarba de Mureș was defined by survival and rebuilding. Villages lay in ruins, and the agricultural cycle was broken by the destruction of fields, livestock, and infrastructure. Returning residents encountered a landscape scarred by trenches, minefields, and unburied dead. The winter of 1944-1945 was particularly harsh, with shortages of food and shelter exacerbated by the war damage. Families who had fled during the fighting often returned to nothing but rubble. Ethnic divisions added another layer of suffering as Romanian and Hungarian civilians remembered the battle differently, sometimes viewing each other with suspicion or hostility long after the fighting had ended. The psychological dimension also grew in importance. Veterans of the battle carried profound trauma. Romanian survivors described the sense of futility in repeated attacks, the loss of entire companies and hours, and the enduring memory of advancing over ground covered with the dead. Hungarian defenders recalled the relentless artillery bombardments and the exhaustion of holding the line under constant pressure. Both perspectives reveal the immense human toll of the battle, not only in numbers, but also in the emotional scars that remained long after the front moved away. In the broader scope of the war, Oarba de Mureș demonstrated the harsh logic of late 1944 combat in Eastern Europe. Offensive operations were driven as much by political imperatives as by military necessity. Romania needed to prove loyalty to its new allies. The Soviet Union demanded relentless pressure on Axis defenses, and Germany and Hungary sought to delay the inevitable advance towards Central Europe. The result was a battle in which all sides endured great suffering but achieved little lasting strategic advantage. It was a confrontation defined less by maneuver and more by the grim arithmetic of attrition. By the beginning of 1945, the Oarba sector had faded from immediate military significance, yet its memory endured. For Romanians, it became a symbol of sacrifice tied to the restoration of national borders. For Hungarians, it stood as a defense of contested land during a doomed war. For Germans and Soviets, it was one episode among many in the final campaigns of the Eastern Front. Yet for the civilians who lived through it, Oarba remained a personal catastrophe, remembered in destroyed homes, lost family members, and fields that bore scars of war for years to come. When the fighting finally moved beyond the Mureș Valley in late 1944, the battlefield at Oarba was left as a devastated scar. Soviet and Romanian forces pressed westward toward Cluj, Budapest, and eventually Vienna, while German and Hungarian armies withdrew, regrouped, and attempted new defensive lines. Yet the consequences of the clash lingered long after the strategic focus shifted. The immediate aftermath of Oarba de Mureș revealed itself in military reports, civilian suffering, and the reshaping of political narratives on all sides. For the Romanian army, the aftermath meant reconstitution under severe strain. Divisions shattered during October had to be rebuilt with new drafts of conscripts, many of them teenagers or men with minimal training. Equipment was provided through Soviet supply, often mismatched with what Romanian troops had used previously. Officers who had survived the slaughter were tasked with welding together units that scarcely resembled the seasoned formations they had once commanded. Despite exhaustion, these rebuilt divisions were ordered into further operations in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The shadow of Oarba followed them. Soldiers carried memories of heavy casualties and a growing conviction that their role in the alliance was to provide expendable manpower. Morale fluctuated, and resentment towards Soviet command grew, even as discipline was enforced to ensure compliance. For the Soviets, Oarba was absorbed into the larger operational picture. Reports acknowledged the heavy fighting and noted Romanian losses, but Soviet historiography downplayed the event, focusing instead on the strategic success of the Second Ukrainian Front in driving the Axis from Transylvania. The episode was recorded as one among many difficult battles on the road to Budapest. Yet on the ground, Soviet units had witnessed the toll firsthand. Some officers later admitted privately that Romanian troops had been pushed beyond reasonable limits, but official accounts emphasized the determination and unity of the Allied effort. This divergence between lived experience and political narrative would persist in the post-war memory. German and Hungarian forces treated Oarba as a temporary defensive success. Hungarian accounts in particular highlighted the bravery of their soldiers in holding off repeated assaults against overwhelming numbers. For Hungary, which would soon suffer the siege of Budapest, Oarba became part of a broader story of sacrifice and defense against an unstoppable enemy. German officers used the episode as an example of what well-prepared defenses could achieve, But they also recognized that such engagements could not alter the collapsing strategic situation. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht faced the Red Army on Hungarian soil, and the defense of Transylvania was no longer tenable. Civilian life in the Oarba region was marked by profound devastation. The villages closest to the battlefield were nearly destroyed. Winter descended on communities without roofs, livestock, or harvests. Survivors lived in cellars, improvised shelters, or among ruins. Epidemics spread as sanitary conditions collapsed. Graves marked by makeshift crosses dotted the fields, while many bodies remained unburied for months. Families returning after displacement often found their homes gone, and their farmland contaminated with mines and unexploded ordnance. Reconstruction was slow, hindered by the lack of resources in a country exhausted by years of war. The immediate political consequences were significant. Romania, now firmly in the Allied camp, presented Oarba as proof of its contribution to victory. Government declarations emphasized the sacrifices of its soldiers, arguing that northern Transylvania had been reclaimed through blood. These claims resonated internationally, reinforcing Romania's position at the post-war peace conferences. Yet domestically, soldiers and families questioned whether the price had been justified, especially as Soviet dominance in Romania grew. What had been framed as a demonstration of national loyalty also revealed the limited sovereignty of Romania under Soviet oversight. For Hungary, the loss of northern Transylvania after the war was a deep national wound. The memory of Oarba was tied to this outcome, a place where Hungarians had fought fiercely to defend territory, only to see it permanently lost. This sense of defeat was compounded by the devastation of Budapest and the subsequent Soviet occupation. Oarba entered Hungarian memory not as a decisive battle, but as a symbol of resistance in a war whose outcome could no longer be changed. In the wider European context, Oarba de Mureș was overshadowed by larger battles of the Eastern Front. The sieges of Budapest and Vienna, the operations in East Prussia, and the final push to Berlin dominated the narrative of late 1944 and early 1945. Yet, for those directly involved, Romanian soldiers, Hungarian defenders, German officers, and civilians of the valley, the battle remained unforgettable. The human losses, the destruction of entire communities, and the political interpretations that followed ensured that Oarba would live on in regional memory, even if it never achieved the same recognition in global histories of the war. By early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Austria and Czechoslovakia, the Mureș Valley slowly returned to silence. Snow-covered trenches and shell holes, concealing the evidence of combat beneath a temporary white shroud. But beneath the surface, scars remained, both physical and psychological. The aftermath of Oarba was not merely military or political. It was human, enduring in the lives of survivors long after the war had ended. The legacy of Oarba de Mureș did not end with the cessation of combat operations in late 1944. In the years and decades that followed, the battle became a symbol loaded with different meanings depending on the perspective from which it was remembered. For Romania, it came to represent both sacrifice and vindication. The tens of thousands of casualties were invoked as proof that the Romanian army had paid in blood for the restoration of national unity. Official narratives emphasized that northern Transylvania was not simply regained through diplomatic decisions at the Paris Peace Conference, but through the immense losses endured by Romanian soldiers in battles such as Oarba. State commemorations in the post-war period framed the site as a place of heroism and martyrdom, where the cost of liberation had been exacted. For the Soviet Union, the battle was integrated into the wider story of the Red Army's unstoppable advance toward Berlin. In Soviet historiography, the role of Romanian forces was acknowledged, but subordinated to the narrative of Soviet command and Soviet victory. Oarba was not singled out as a unique tragedy, but rather as one of many hard-fought engagements necessary to crush the Axis. In practice, however, the memory of Romanian sacrifices was politically useful. It reinforced the legitimacy of Soviet influence in Romania, portraying the alliance as one cemented by shared struggle. This framing would dominate official discourse in Eastern Europe for decades. Hungary, meanwhile, remembered Oarba as part of the national tragedy of the Second World War. Hungarian defenders saw their resistance as valiant, but its ultimate futility was overshadowed by the subsequent siege and destruction of Budapest, the loss of northern Transylvania, and the imposition of Soviet occupation. For Hungarian communities in Transylvania, the memory of Oarba was especially bitter. It symbolized not only the violence of the front lines, but also the permanence of post-war territorial settlements that placed them within the Romanian state. In Hungarian historical writing, the battle became one of several episodes illustrating the nation's desperate but doomed fight in the final year of the war. German accounts largely treated Oarba as an example of effective defense in unfavorable conditions, but it was ultimately absorbed into the broader narrative of Wehrmacht operations in the Balkans and Carpathian Basin. By the time of post-war memoirs and military studies, Oarba received relatively little attention compared to larger operations such as the Battle of Budapest. Yet the tactical lessons drawn about defensive preparation, terrain, and the ability to hold off numerically superior attackers were consistent with German military doctrine. At the local level, memory was shaped by direct experience. Villages destroyed in the battle were rebuilt slowly, with scars of combat visible for decades in the form of craters, ruined buildings, and unexploded ordnance. Families of the fallen created informal memorials, later formalized into cemeteries and monuments. The Romanian cemetery at Oarba de Mureș, where thousands of soldiers were buried, became a focal point for commemoration. Annual ceremonies reinforced the site's symbolic importance as a place of national sacrifice. For local Hungarians, however, these commemorations were viewed differently, often as a reminder of contested narratives of belonging and loss. The long-term significance of Oarba de Mureș extended beyond national memory. It highlighted the complex dynamics of alliance and subordination that characterized the later stages of the Second World War in Eastern Europe. Romania's role illustrated how smaller states, once allied with Germany, were compelled to prove loyalty to the Allies at immense human cost. Hungary's experience reflected the desperation of defending territory under existential threat, even as defeat became inevitable. For the Soviet Union, it was one more step in a march that redefined the political map of Europe. Historians today debate the strategic necessity of the battle. Some argue that the prolonged assaults were avoidable and driven more by political imperatives than by operational logic. Others note that the broader Soviet strategy demanded relentless pressure on all sectors, and that the sacrifices at Oarba were part of this wider approach. What is beyond dispute is the scale of the human cost relative to the limited territorial outcome achieved. This disparity ensured that the battle would be remembered as one of the bloodiest engagements fought by the Romanian army in the Second World War. In the end, Oarba de Mureș stands as both a military episode and a cultural memory. Its fields became graveyards, its villages symbols of resilience and loss, and its story a contested narrative across Romanian, Hungarian, Soviet, and German histories. The battle's legacy continues to echo in memorial ceremonies, historical debates, and the lived memory of communities shaped by its devastation. It remains a reminder of the immense price paid by nations and individuals in the final years of the most destructive conflict in European history.